From memory.
Some of them were from memory, and some of them new books of fiqh.
New books in America, in 19th century.
Of course, because you think about this. You're a slave in America. You're a practicing Muslim. You know, what do you do for your prayer? Some of the slave owners wouldn't let them pray. Oh. So what do you do for your prayer? So they'd write books of fiqh for, you know, the Muslims in America.
Oh, this is amazing.
It's amazing. It completely changes, you know, your life entirely. But you find many of the Muslim slaves, as soon as they came, you know, they would say, okay, we're slaves, but we're slaves of Allah. We have to pray 5 times a day. And it was said no matter how much they would be punished, they would always make their 5 prayers. Now, some of the slave owners, you know, were Christians, you know, at least nominal Christians. You know, whether their actions followed this or not, it's very hard to say. It's not for us to really discuss this. But they respected the rights of them. They said they want to pray to God, no problem with them pray. So you find that there were some places where the slaves were actually allowed to pray. And the slave owners would build them, you know, a place in the house, or, you know, not in the house, but on the outside, where they were able to fulfill their prayers.
Do we have a rest of these buildings maybe in some places in America?
You might have some places that were known. We do know that they existed. You know, it might have been a shed. They'd say you can have the shed.
They had
it had a dual purpose.
They had their own sheds on the, like, you know, aside the plantations that they were working on, and
definitely, yeah. So many of the Muslims were able to, you know, pray 5 times a day.
They built like small masjids. They have the Quran. They have the fiqh. There was a big community.
It was available, but in the end they were slaves. And as a slave, it's very hard to pass on your heritage. I mean, as a slave, you're working night and day. You know, you don't have much time. You don't have a madrasa. You don't have the masjids. No doubt the community is not going to benefit like before. So this is how Islam, you know, it became cut off. But in this first generation of slaves, you did find many of them, and especially the Muslims were known for this, is they would revolt. There were many slave revolts, not so much in the USA, but more so in South America. You would find that the slaves, they would refuse. They would say, we're not slaves. And they'd actually plot together. They'd say to each other, you know, speaking to each other, you know, let us plan to overthrow our owners. And some of them would, you know, they'd revolt, and they'd actually go around attacking other slave owners, liberating their brothers, Muslim or not. You know, they'd liberate them as slaves. And it was said that some of them,
I was just going to mention the point about how some of the owners, they, you know, let the slaves pray. Some of them, they didn't. You know, it's just a good lesson to take because, you know, now there's just some Muslims, we have the freedom, you know, there's no punishment, and, you know, we're leaving our prayers, and, you know, some of the slaves, they didn't even, you know, they'd get whipped and stuff. So, I mean, this is just a good lesson to take.
This is a beautiful point, and he's seeing them praying in this adversity, and it really makes you appreciate your salat that you have now. Now, seeing a lot of these people revolting, as I said, especially in South America, around Brazil, there was a group of slaves. They would revolt. They'd get captured again, and they'd revolt again. And they were Muslims, and they revolted so much that the people said, you know, we're not going to waste time with these guys anymore. They put them on a ship and sent them back to Africa.
So the rebellion was success.
They made it
back.
They had enough.
They gained their freedom.
They got their freedom because, you know, the slave owners, they couldn't afford to look after these people anymore. It was far cheaper to actually just send them back to Africa.
Is this there's a place in West Africa right now, Liberia? Is this where they went back to? Because I mean, now it's known there was a lot of former African American slaves who made their own country.
So. Liberia came a long time later. You know, once you had at least the Emancipation Proclamation saying that the slaves are free, they sent a lot of them back to Africa, and America had this land, and they gave it to the slaves. This is called Liberia, and they named it after Monroe, James Monroe. They called the capital Monrovia. This happened a long time later. We're still talking about, you know, the early stages of slavery, where they rebelled. Eventually, you know, these people, slavery was part of the American life. You know, the slave, if they were Muslims, they lost their religion.
Yes, because in sometimes they were separated, the man from woman, the child from a father. So it is very hard from father to learn to educate his son or his daughter of Islam, because they were separate sometimes. Maybe he's one far away from his son. Maybe he was far away from his son because of separation.
No.
And you were saying before, you know, some of them were able to pray and everything. Alhamdulillah, that's good. But there were, you know, even some of the, like, you know, a lot of the Christians, they call themselves, you know, devout but they always made an excuse to say that the slaves from Africa, they were less, they were better than them,
Yes.
and in this way they called themselves good Christians, but at the same time they still oppressed them.
And some of them try to use the Bible to justify this.
Exactly, yeah.
It's something amazing. From an Islamic perspective, you couldn't justify such a thing. You see how Islam honored, subhanAllah, people who were slaves from Africa. Bilal, radiallahu anhu, our master Bilal. How he went from being, an Ethiopian slave, which was like the lowest of lows in the Arabian society before Islam. And it was said that after the conquest of Syria, Bilal was offered the governorship of Syria, the richest place in the world at that time. And this is going like being a slave.
He was a slave. Imagine the slave. He's an opportunity to be a governor.
Yeah.
And recently in America we have today president. It takes maybe it took maybe 400 years for this in America. And in Muslim world you can see like in a couple of years it is possible from a slave to become a governor.
No. So it's interesting to note, how progressive Islamic society was as compared to even America at this time. Now, fast forwarding a bit, actually around the time of the founding of America, you had, after the War of Independence, you found that, many of the early, the forefathers, the founding fathers of the USA, it's interesting to take a look at their religious attitudes. Because especially now, as we're going to take a look at it a little bit later, USA in our days, the treatment of Muslims is a contentious issue. I don't think any of us had to explain why. We're going to look at this. But when you actually go back to the forefathers of the USA, one thing that I will admit, generally speaking, like the American Constitution was an amazing document. The American Constitution, in part, was actually, you can trace it back to the Constitution of Medina, granting these freedoms. I remember even studying in our history class, the idea of a constitution was actually taken from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is going from Medina all the way up until the USA. And the constitution, at least by what it said, it wasn't always acted upon.
This was only in theory.
In theory, at least in theory, these were amazing ideas. And when you saw some of the forefathers, like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, for example, Benjamin Franklin, he founded a place in Pennsylvania as a place of prayer. And he made it very specific, because you have to remember, America was founded by people escaping religious persecution. They were escaping, the fundamentalism of the UK and people taking away their rights. Or they were the fundamentalists, trying to escape people taking away their rights. So Benjamin Franklin, he believed in religious plurality. And a quote of his, he said regarding this prayer room, because people asked, is it open to anyone? Catholic, Protestant, Lutheran, is it open to anyone? To make a point about how open he was to religion, he said, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send a messenger, a missionary to preach Mohammedanism or Islam to us, he would find a pulpit at his service. Meaning, even if a Muslim came, because you didn't have too many Muslims in those early stages, people who were still practicing Islam. Even if the Mufti of Constantinople wanted to send someone, he's free to come and teach about Islam in our lands. How times have changed.
So we're finding religious tolerance going way back in the United States of America.
Annie, this is how the forefathers of the US were. If you want to know as an American, how did Benjamin Franklin treat Muslims? This is what he says, I'm open to this.
I listened that there was Masoni.
Many of them were Freemasons. And we don't want to get in too much into this, but a lot of the Freemasons, they did believe in this religious plurality. We're not going to get into their intentions behind this, but we leave it at this. You can be a good person. Being a Christian, you can say words of truth, allowing Muslims to worship freely. Generally, this is a good thing.
So it was his word, or just the government could apply that?
No, this is his word, and they showed it in action.
Yeah.
I mean, the Mufti of Constantinople didn't send anyone.
Yeah. I just it's its own idea, not the.
It's in theory.
Yeah.
And you saw later on when Muslims did come originally, they were very free to practice their religion. You see, in 1797, another president, his name is John Adams, and he actually signed a treaty at this time, saying that the United States had no character of enmity against the laws, the religion, or the tranquility of Muslims. Basically saying America has nothing against Muslims. He's very open about this, saying America as a nation has no problem with Islam.
And why they have problems with Islam?
This is what we're going to talk about later, but at least we want to establish, first of all, what the forefathers of the US, at least in theory, were saying. Muslims are welcome to come to this land. Of course, this changed later on. I mean, we see now, as we said, you find people wanting to go to Islam to preach Islam. They say you're not welcome. Your name's on this list. You can't come to the airport. How times have changed. But we want to look at why times have changed.
Blacklists.
Because we know, looking through history, history is not just about ideas, what you write on a paper. It's about politics. It's about reality. And this is what we want to look at in history. I mean, I can tell you that Benjamin Franklin said this. It doesn't mean that every American is going to agree to it. So we want to take a look at why this has changed and where things are going. Now, it's very interesting that you actually find in the United States Supreme Court building. This is the Supreme Court of the USA in Washington, D.C. There's a series of statues of famous lawmakers like Hammurabi, all of these historical famous people of Moses, Musa alayhi salam. And one of the statues was of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it's a statue. A statue of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as they say, one of the great lawmakers in history at the U.S. Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. Now, of course, we know as Muslims this is haram. And to make a statue of anybody is wrong. Of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of course, is completely wrong. So it's actually still there now. And a lot of Muslims started to protest against this.
Excuse me, who made this statue? Muslims or
No, not Muslims.
Yeah.
Not Muslims. And the guide that they would give to tourists, the guide says, a statue of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the Muslims, they protested. They said, please get rid of this statue. But you find there's actually some of the more liberal Muslims said, no, keep it.
Did they make it as a good thing or
as a good thing?
As a good thing.
Generally, it's a good thing. They don't have a problem with statues. They don't see the qualm. Make a statue of Moses, make a statue of God Himself. They've got no problem with it.
But the idea that they saying that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is a great person.
Yeah, he was one of the great lawmakers of history. And this is the intent to show the respect that they had for Islam. Now, once the Muslims started to protest, they didn't remove the statue. But at least they changed it in their guide. This statue is supposed to be a representation of the personage of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but it doesn't represent him.
Yes, because we do not believe in that statue. Because, as we know, the Christians, they are presenting for example, Jesus like a Zeus, as a Zeus, like a...
Yeah, they draw God, like you go into the Sistine Chapel and see this. And even Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we don't know how he looked. So any representation is not going to be correct. It's not correct to lie about a person. So this is, one of the reasons, along with idolatry, of why we, avoid this.
This is a good reminder to the Muslims, because I remember, when I was a kid, it's not a statue, but just not having knowledge. There was basically, a movie called like Prince of Egypt. It was about Moses, and they depicted Moses. So I mean, it's just a good reminder for Muslims that it's just totally haram in Islam.
Yeah, of course. To avoid this altogether, we know this as Muslims. Now we see also in 1955. There was also another statue of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as they say, a statue made of him. It was actually in a courthouse in New York, in New York City. There's another one. Alhamdulillah, this one was removed because the ambassadors of Indonesia, Pakistan, and Egypt, may Allah reward them, they said to the US, remove this. This is an insult to our religion. We respect why you did this, trying to show that you tolerate Islam and you want to show some veneration to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But it's actually an insult to us. So alhamdulillah, this one they removed, but the one in Washington, D.C., it still remains.
But they changed the name.
They didn't change the name, but what they said in their guidebook is this is supposed to be a representation of the personality of Muhammad